Tea adjournment at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry. Justice Madlanga starting off today's proceedings by going back to the focus on the preferring of charges against National Police Commissioner Masimula, the chair contending that the PFMA charge as a standalone charge doesn't fall within IDAC's mandate. There must be additional charges or offences accompanying it, but additional charges could not hold, according to him, because Advocate Johnson had indicated already that evidence of the commission of corruption and fraud is not admissible when it comes to Masimula. Justice Madlanga also contending that Masimula also shouldn't have been lumped with those charged with fraud and corruption, whereas his are statutory violations relating merely to the PFMA. He says the consequence thereof of lumping him with the other accused is that society was unable or continues to be unable to make a distinction between his charge and the other charges, but they are generally jointly labelled as corruption accused, which essentially visits a level of embarrassment to the National Commissioner, which he contends was ultimately probably the reason to embarrass him. Now, Commissioner Sandile Khumalo buttressed the chair's point, saying the PFMA charge is not sustainable on the face of it because IDAC can't even support an allegation that the police commissioner took long to act, purely because there is no indication in General Matlo's affidavit when exactly Masimula was advised to terminate it, where one then can arrive at a conclusion that he took long. You must essentially have a time frame to measure and from there conclude that perhaps he took too long. But General Matlo's affidavit merely stating that Masimula was advised on the concerns around the Matlala tender, which he ultimately terminated. Very interesting exchanges. Let's take you now to the Brigitte Mabandla Justice College, where we find my colleague, Ayanda Nyathi. A very good morning to you, Ayanda. The focus essentially at this juncture being General Matlo's affidavit insofar as it relates to charges preferred against the National Police Commissioner Masimula. The commissioner's unconvinced today that there was a basis to charge Commissioner Masimula based on just the contents of that affidavit by General Matlo.
It's quite the position that the Commission has put to Advocate Andrea Johnson, this idea that all of this points to some kind of orchestrated effort to try and target Masimula and also by extension Khumalo, I beg your pardon, that's the head of the PKTT and the head of crime intelligence, as well as, of course, Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi. So a considerable amount of time was actually spent drilling into what exactly IDAC believes Masimula did and whether or not that allegation falls within the mandate of IDAC. We had Andrea Johnson conceding here that if Masimula did anything wrong, it has to do with the Public Finance Management Act. And we do know, of course, that IDAC, since its establishment, was not put together to investigate those kind of claims. And so perhaps let's kick off by just taking you to a part of the testimony where the chairperson of this inquiry, Justice Madlanga, put it to the witness on the stand that the reason why it seems IDAC even went for Masimula was to try and embarrass and taint him. Take a listen.
Why was the Commissioner Masimula lumped with these people, charged with fraud and corruption, when he is not? When he is charged with the statutory offenses provided for in the PFMA, why was he lumped with these people? At face value, it seems to me that this must have been done to embarrass him, to taint him and to make the public or to cause the public to see him as also being complicit in fraud and corruption. People are not going to, ordinary members of the public are not going to analyze this. He stands there with people charged with corruption, fraud. He stands there with them. And most of the noise when the case is talked about, it is going to be about the fraud and corruption. People are not going to delineate and say, but not Masimula. Do you see what I mean? So this was done, I suggest to you, to embarrass him, to taint him, and to make him look as if he too has committed fraud and corruption. That was calculated, I suggest to you.
It's quite the proposition, isn't it? And we heard Advocate Andrea Johnson pushing back against that, saying she accepts the criticism, but as far as she's concerned, at the very least, it's a difference of opinion with how they interpreted the law, but she appreciates that the optics at the very least aren't great. Canny Maphanga is our senior reporter who's been listening into that testimony and joins us now live. And Canny, it brings us once again back to the fundamental question that was being asked even before Andrea Johnson appeared, which is what motivated IDAC's decisions?
And the answers lie in the patterns that continue to persist before the probe, which is that none of these cases engaged IDAC's mandate, nor was it followed in a manner which would support a legal or factual basis to have all of these generals in court. And the only conclusion you can get to is that these three had to be removed. And we did see that with the Brooklyn incident, that it was almost going to be Lieutenant General Madlanga, or at least that's what the allegation or the suspicion was. But we know that at the very least, Lieutenant General Dumsani Khumalo was in court. That case has now fallen away. It was provisionally withdrawn. And General Masimula was added on at a later stage to the SABC Medicare contract. Now, why this questioning is so important? Because at the very least, this is a room of investigators as well, but a large room of lawyers who are actually professional prosecutors.
And they're experienced.
Absolutely, and questions should have emerged. I mean, Advocate Andrea Johnson has experience with even the Scorpions. So questions should have emerged about charging him single-handedly with just the PFMA and within the context of the mandate of IDAC, because that distinction has to be made that here we're dealing with IDAC and what they could and could not do. And in this instance, he could not be charged along with the accused at a later stage just on the PFMA, because remember when he was charged, raised questions on whether or not all the accounting officers were going to be charged in this particular matter as well. But we've established, and I think she has accepted the suggestion that he should not have been charged on the PFMA alone, and he couldn't have been lumped into the other accused without drawing a connection between the fraud and corruption, because that is not an additional charge that you add just to one person. He had to have been actively engaged in the fraud and corruption for those charges to stand. And the only conclusion you can get to is that what we saw was what was intended. It was all about making sure that he makes it into that court dock. He gets charged. Of course, his name is tainted in that SABC Medicare contract, and what then follows, he has to step down in the interim while this case continues. So it's the second general who is suspected to be part of the target that then gets also out of the way. And we saw that with Lieutenant General Dumsani Khumalo, through those bail conditions, he also was pushed to the side. And the suspicion was that Lieutenant General Madlanga was next, and we did see some form of action taking place there at the Brooklyn SABS, but how we understand it is that the investigators never showed up on that day. And of course, that is how the matters or the warrants of arrest went under review by the NDPP. So all of these actions that you continue to see IDAC embroiled in does not reflect well on the unit. It points to evidence that suggests that there may have been some form of truth to the suspicions and the allegations swirling IDAC, that it was allegedly being used as a tool to fight those SABS factional wars. They were very interested in crime intelligence, very interested in the PKTT, but really that interest sat at a few individuals, and we saw that at the very least two of the three were successfully charged, and effectively the consequence of that was that they were removed from their posts in the interim, and there's a suspicion that with what happened at Brooklyn that Mkhwanazi was next. However, it's a difficult balancing act for the Commission to try and get the core issues from Advocate Andrea Johnson, because she takes this position as if she is far removed from the conduct, and she can at this stage because she has since resigned and won't follow that accountability process that you would expect on that side if she was still the IDAC head. There would have been an inquiry, we would have had a better understanding. But we do know that several other key role players in IDAC will be called to explain this particular interest in matters that directly resulted in on consequences for top generals, not so much other individuals. There was a specific need to have these individuals dealt with, and the question remains why.
Yeah, and I think we should also, really emphasize the point that you've made, Canny, that the Commission has really concerned itself with IDAC's mandate. And in fact, it's a point that the chairperson of the inquiry also made, that as far as they're concerned, they're not making a pronouncement of whether or not Canny Maphanga has a case to answer with regards to the Public Finance Management Act. The question, though, that occupies their time is whether or not that issue should have been investigated by IDAC to begin with. Take a listen.
Advocate Johnson, you should not leave your seat when your testimony is concluded, being under the belief that the commissioners are suggesting that General Masimula has no case to answer insofar as the PFMA is concerned. We are not suggesting that at all. What we are focusing on is IDAC's mandate. IDAC, insofar as the PFMA is concerned, on our reading, IDAC's mandate is only if there are other charges and then the PFMA charges are additional to that. That's all that we are saying at this stage. It's about IDAC's mandate.
I hear you.
You see what I mean?
I understand.
So whether or not PMA offenses have in fact been committed is something else altogether, but it's not something that must be pursued by IDAC. That's all we are suggesting to you.
Thank you, Chair.
So there you have it, the chairperson saying that Canny Maphanga may very well have a case to answer, but it's not really IDAC that must ensure to that end. Canny, as we round up, I suppose, we have gotten an indication that Andrea Johnson's time before this inquiry is also coming to an end. We're told that the evidence leader won't be going past lunchtime, and it's been quite an important, consequential 5.5 days, many might say, for the head of IDAC, especially because even after this inquiry, you get the sense that she may have other questions she has to answer outside of the space.
Well, I think in terms of closing the chapter at IDAC, we're not sure about how much accountability you'll see there, because she did walk away from the post and the president agreed to the request. But there's certain things that have happened at IDAC that could delve into alleged criminal misconduct, which could reach further consequences if found that she was allegedly party to this conduct. I mean, even if you look at the evidence that we're hearing so far, that Sunil Belichin allegedly went to Sergeant Fanny Nkosi in prison without his lawyers being present in order to get a statement that would allegedly implicate Masimula and Khumalo. And you look at the evidence of Paramore allegedly manufacturing statements in order to pursue cases against these top generals. There's a lot to answer to, and even allegations from her past coming from Witness O, which deal with alleged improper conduct and is currently before the NDPP for a decision, or rather before the NPA for a decision. So there's certainly other consequences that could flow from the testimony, but in terms of that particular chapter at IDAC, I think it may be a wrap for that.
All right, Canny Maphanga, thanks very much indeed. As always, Canny is our senior reporter here at the Brigitte Mabandla Justice College. It's not over yet, and in fact, if the last 5 days are anything to go by, Andrea Johnson may still be have her feet really pressed close to the fire for the remaining time here on the witness stand. We expect it to resume once again at 11:45, that's quarter to midday, and we'll certainly do exactly that when the time comes.